Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. In today's gospel, we witness women going to the tomb looking for Jesus. They're expecting to find his body and expecting and looking to anoint him. Instead, what they find is that the tomb is open, Jesus is not there, and there's a young man who tells them Jesus is risen, but not before telling them, do not be afraid. Jesus is risen. He has gone before you, and he's in Galilee. Go and tell your friends, Jesus has risen as he has promised. Go and tell others. Instead, the women are so caught up in witnessing what they were not expecting that they don't go and tell others. Instead, the book of Mark ends in fear and in silence. There's no proof of Jesus' resurrection. Jesus does not appear and speak to the women. Jesus does not go to the disciples' homes. Thomas does not put his finger in his wounds. There's no revelation on the road to Emmaus. They don't have any proof. And if we're in the scenario in this gospel text together today, we also have no proof that Jesus has resurrected. All we have is a promise. We have a promise that Jesus has said he would resurrect on the third day, and Jesus has resurrected, and Jesus is now declared, I am going ahead of you. I'm in Galilee. Tell others, I have risen. So while we want and crave proof that Jesus has resurrected and is among us in this season, in this moment of life and ministry, Jesus is inviting us not to crave or seek proof, but trust in the promise. That Jesus is in the places like those in the book of Mark, where Jesus lifts up Peter's mother-in-law when she has a high fever, where Jesus feeds the hungry, when Jesus feeds the multitudes, when Jesus liberates the demoniac, where Jesus is present where the needs arise. Not only in a particular place, but in particular seasons of people's lives where the need is, there is Jesus. Jesus has gone ahead of us. As he promised, he has risen. He is among us. And now, yet again, he invites us to follow him. Follow him to the places where there is most need. Follow him to be bold and courageous and unapologetic about the good news that is not only for us, but for all. Where others too may want proof that Jesus is alive, proof that Jesus can liberate and make anew and heal and provide, proof. So many of us in this world, in this season, want proof, and Jesus is inviting us to trust the promise that Jesus is present. Jesus is present and roaming around and loose in the world and inviting us to be loose in the world for the sake of healing and transformation, to be available and to be present where the need arises. To lean into the promise of what Jesus has told us, what Jesus has promised us in our hearts and in our spirits, what we know to be true. While we in our flesh want proof, our spirits are invited to trust what Jesus has promised us. That Jesus is alive, that Jesus has conquered death and the grave, that Jesus understands grief and trauma and pain, and Jesus has conquered that too. And now Jesus is inviting us to be bold and courageous and unapologetic and willing to follow him for the sake of life, for the sake of liberation and transformation, not just for us, but for all. And so today, as we celebrate that we too are Easter people, that we are out in the world and willing and trusting that God is with us as we walk, and not only with us, ahead of us, that where we go, Jesus is already ahead of us, that we are not alone, that God is with us, that God has anointed us for such a time as this, to follow Jesus and to trust his promise that he is with us and will never forsake us. And we are called for such a time as this. May we believe the resurrection promise. May we follow Jesus into newness and into beauty and into a world that is complex and messy and beloved by the God of the universe, who has taken on flesh, conquered death and the grave, and is alive among us and ahead of us. Thanks be to God. Happy Easter.